This is Tradition 2 for service. The questions are included at the end. It is suggested to get a copy of Guiding Principles to follow along. Tradition 2. In service. Groups focus on our primary purpose, to carry the message to the addict who still suffers. Service, beyond the group, carries out some secondary purposes, creating meeting lists, getting literature into facilities, or putting on a dance. Each of these, in turn, supports our primary purpose. NA service is always connected in some way to our group purpose and is under the same direction. Our leaders do not govern, service is not authority, and the ability to serve depends on the trust of those around us. When we need to make a decision, it can be helpful to talk about spiritual principles. Spiritual principles can be a lens through which we examine ideas. Actions taken in anger, resentment, or haste tend to create trouble down the road. Taking time to consider principles may not change a decision, but it may change the way we carry it out, and that can make all the difference. There are differing practices of group conscience within our fellowship. Some members believe that the key word in the phrase is group, and that the conscience described in the second tradition exists only in the NA groups as described in the group booklet. Because this view holds that the conscience resides in the group, all decisions should go back to the home groups whenever possible. It requires careful planning because the simplest decisions can take months to make and excellent communication between groups and service bodies. Although service boards and committees are always accountable to the groups as well as to a higher power, not all groups enjoy exercising that authority on a day-to-day basis. It can distract from the primary purpose of the groups and is liable to slow service efforts. Many NA communities operate differently, and values and practices vary widely across the fellowship. In other places, a broader understanding of group conscience allows for the understanding that what happens in service bodies is no less spiritual than what happens in NA groups. One member asked how it could be that an authority so powerful could be expressed only in one possible outlet. For him, the idea that conscience was restricted to one level of service put unnecessary limitations on the understanding of a higher power. Many of us have been parts of service bodies or committees that seem to operate out of a shared understanding of purpose and values that was consistent across the committee and across time, much like a strong home group. The experience of being part of a committee or work group that takes on this kind of momentum can be exciting, but it's important to remember our lines of accountability in NA service. Participants may feel the conscience of a service body in its consensus and enthusiasm, but maintaining communication and inclusion in our communities is essential. When consensus inside a committee doesn't match consensus outside that committee, disunity can result. Often the result is not open conflict, but a simple fading of energy. If service is not attractive or inclusive, our efforts tend to last a while and then fizzle out. When energy and enthusiasm are fading, we can often look to the second tradition to understand why. The times when we are most passionate about a particular issue in service may also be when we're most at risk of becoming closed-minded or being led astray, and least likely to see those risks for ourselves. Passion for service is a gift, and there are certainly times we do need to stand up for principle. During these moments, staying in touch with the spirit of goodwill that guides our service is a must. We need to keep an eye on our passion, lest it become self-righteousness, and we keep an eye on our disagreements, lest we begin to harbor ill will toward our fellows. Vigilance is an inside job. We ask ourselves about our sense of proportion. Does the size of our feelings match the size of the issue? The second tradition doesn't exempt us from the need sometimes to protect our program from the internal and external forces that may destroy us, but it reminds us that we are not the ultimate authority in NA. It can be surprising when an emotional conflict leads to a renewal of faith, but when a storm passes, the resilience of our fellowship and the love we feel within it can bring us to a new level of surrender. We can trust NA to survive, even when growing pains are severe. We are much more productive when we build structures in which responsibilities are outlined, roles are clear, and simple checks are in place as a part of the process. Mentoring, supporting, and encouraging members in their efforts to serve can simply make it easier to do the next right thing. Accountability is a two-way street. When our relationship to our services lacks trust, service is unattractive. Leadership in a group, on a committee, or simply in performing a specific task is an honor, a privilege, and a form of service. We must understand and honor the limits on our role and the difference between service and government. If we confuse them, we are generally not confused for long. NA communities have a tendency to correct that behavior, sometimes in pretty ungentle ways. For ourselves as well as our fellowship, it's important that we recognize the difference between getting things done and governing. When we honor the trust placed in us, leadership and service can be one and the same. Workshop questions. The questions below offer a way to begin or continue a service discussion or workshop focused on this tradition. 1. Does a service body have a group conscience? How do we exercise group conscience in service? How do we invite a loving higher power into our decisions? 2. What does a good group conscience process look like? What would an observer notice about decision-making in our service body? 3. How best do we involve groups in our process? How does our work impact other service bodies? What's the relationship between communication and tradition? 2. Question 4. How does our service body practice spiritual principles in our work and in our meetings? How do we allow a loving higher power to guide our process and service efforts? 5. What are the risks of uniformity in our decision-making process? How do we consider different perspectives as we make decisions? Do we ensure that minority voices are honored? Do we consider the views of those who cannot or do not speak for themselves? 6. How does our understanding of anonymity help us apply the second tradition? Are there people or ideas we are unwilling to hear? How do we reconcile the need to hear many viewpoints with our desire for efficiency and simplicity? 7. What is the difference between practicing patience and avoiding a discussion or decision? Do we rush into decisions or discuss them until we arrive at a solution? What is the value of listening to all viewpoints? How does our service benefit or suffer from the quality of our discussions? 8. Is involvement in our service body increasing or decreasing? How might this be connected to the decisions we've been making or the ways we've been making them? 9. How do we see a higher power working through us in service? Do we trust that all will be well? What are our reservations about that? 10. What are some differences between being a servant and being a trusted servant? How does that change our attitudes and actions? 11. What does leadership mean in Narcotics Anonymous? How is that different from its usual meanings? 12. What is the difference between leading and governing? What can we do to ensure that trusted servants lead rather than control? What can we do if a member is trying to govern or dominate a group or a service body? How can we balance rotation and continuity? 13. How does this tradition help us understand anonymity? How does anonymity help us understand this tradition? How do we practice anonymity in terms of this tradition? 14. Discuss any bridges between this tradition and one or more of the 12 concepts. What do these bridges teach us about our service efforts? 15. What more can we do to bring the principles of this tradition into our service efforts? What could we do differently to better carry out our services? I hope this has been helpful. These questions are suggested, not required.